Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar on ride-hailing and public transit partnerships. This is part of a monthly webinar series sponsored by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. NCST is part of the University Transportation Centers program administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation. We're a consortium of 6 universities around the country focused on advancing environmentally sustainable transportation through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of our future leaders. The work you'll be hearing about today has also received support from the state of California via the Public Transportation Account and the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017, better known as Senate Bill 1. Today's webinar is going to last an hour and 15 minutes. We've got a full lineup. In just a moment, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Dan Sperling. Then we're going to have a presentation from our 2 researchers, Dr. Susie Pike, who's a professional researcher at the UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies, and Sarah Kazemian, a PhD candidate in the UC Davis Department of Political Science. Then we're going to ask Christy Wegener, who's the planning director for SamTrans, the San Mateo County Transit District, to join us as well to share some of her experiences on these issues before we have our Q&A at the end. There's a Q&A feature in the Zoom webinar platform on that bottom toolbar. So we'd encourage you to type in your questions there, and we'll do our best to answer all of them. And we will be recording this webinar, and the recording will be available on our website along with the slides, hopefully in the next day or so. So with that, let me introduce our moderator. Dr. Dan Sperling is a distinguished professor of civil engineering and environmental science and policy, and the founding director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. So Dan, take it away.
Thank you so much, Mike. I am so enthusiastic about participating in this webinar. And this is one of the most important topics that we can be addressing when we think about the future of transit and, frankly, the future of ride-hailing companies. And so what you're going to hear here is some very important research that really provides these insights about how these partnerships work, when they could work, how they could work. And I think that will be the foundation for us to have a really good discussion about the future of transit and the future of ride-hailing and their partnerships. So let me give just a tiny bit of context before we get started. The first is that the reality is transit was in the United States was in decline even before the COVID pandemic. And transit serves about 2% of trips, 2% of passenger miles traveled in the US. So while it plays a hugely important role in some locations and for many people, overall it plays a relatively small role. And one of the issues here and one of the questions is, how can that become a bigger, stronger role? How can it provide more mobility and accessibility to more people? So that's the first thing, is about transit being in decline. The second is that ride-hailing growth had already started stabilizing or slowing down. The growth had been starting to slow down before COVID. And I think one of the insights, certainly that I believe in, is the ride-hailing companies need these partnerships to succeed in the future as much as transit does. Number 3 thought I have on this as we prepare for this is that we've created in the United States a car-centric transportation system, car-centric cities, car-centric lifestyles. And the implications and the result of that is that there are large swaths of the population that are marginalized, that don't have good accessibility and mobility. And those are people that have physical limitations and economically limited as well. And even people that have cars, if you have a household with one car, there's people sharing it. It's often an older car that's not reliable. So one of the insights here I think that we should be pursuing is these partnerships, can they play a role? So after hearing these really insightful, valuable, important research findings from Susie and Sarah, and we'll get some response from Christy, we're going to use those insights. We're going to learn about, we'll start thinking about what are the prospects for partnerships. And we'll discuss that after those presentations. So we'll see how can this all play out in the future to the benefit of the population of travelers, of our cities, of our people. So with that, let me turn it over to Susie, Dr. Susie Pike, a, a faculty researcher at the Institute of Transportation Studies. And so take it away, Susie. You're on mute.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for that wonderful introduction and raising those great points about the role of ride hailing and the role of these partnerships in the future of public transport. And good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to be talking today about, my slide's not advancing. Okay, talking today, I'm going to give an overview of the work that we've done for the past 2 years, which included 2 phases of surveys, as well as interviews with transit agencies from around the US. And then Sarah's going to give us an overview of the preliminary findings from our current survey. We just launched our survey last week, and we're already getting some exciting information. We've had a good level of participation. And so that current survey builds on our work related to transit and ride-hailing partnerships, but we couldn't launch a new survey related to public transit without also trying to address some of the impacts of COVID, both on the partnerships as well as other activities of transit agencies. So Sarah will talk about what we're learning so far from that current survey. And I'll give a plug now, but we'll be sharing a link to that survey. So for any transit agency members that are here participating today, if you would like to participate in the survey, we'll share the link for that a little bit later on. So just to start, so certainly the issues that Dan brought up were important in the early launch of some of these partnerships. And what we saw as early as 2016 and 17 were these partnerships springing up all over the US between transit agencies and ride-hail companies. But I couldn't see any clear geographic pattern as to why they were happening in some places and not in other places. And so that really motivated me to want to understand a little more about what was going on behind the scenes leading up to the implementation of these kind of partnerships. And then what we often hear about is really the program side of it. So what's happening on the ground, what kinds of gaps are the programs filling in, and what kinds of discounts are passengers getting, and how do the programs and pilots work. But I was really interested in understanding why it is that some transit agencies seem to be really excited to pursue these partnerships while others are less so. And then, as I mentioned, wanting to understand what was going on behind the scenes is how are transit agencies sharing information with one another, and was this kind of underlying network of information sharing among transit agencies what was leading partnerships to occur in these different places and not in other locations. And then really, as Dan kind of highlighted, some of our work has recently focused on what are the factors that seem to be necessary conditions for these partnerships to happen. And then at the same time, the other side of that question is what are some of the barriers that get in the way when transit agencies might otherwise have an interest and might have a need that could be addressed by these kinds of partnerships? What prevents that from happening? And so these are the overarching questions that we're going to talk about today. I'll start by just giving a brief overview of our study so far. So as I mentioned, we did 2 phases of surveys. So one was almost exactly 2 years ago in late October and November of 2018. And then we did another survey just a year ago in the late fall of 2019. And then in between those 2 survey years, we conducted interviews with some of the agencies that participated in the first survey. That first survey really focused on agencies with partnerships to understand what was happening that led to them implementing them, with a focus on information sharing among transit agencies. I gathered 13 responses. So I will say that we do have a small sample throughout the work that we've been able to do so far. That certainly seems to be changing with our current survey. We've gotten a lot more responses already in the past week than we had to either of our previous surveys. But despite that, we do see trends throughout our work that will highlight and that seem to kind of suggest that there are some things that we can learn from this work so far. So then we did interviews with 7 of the agencies that have participated in the first survey. And we also had this great focus group with the California Transit Association New Mobility Task Force. And I just want to give a shout out to the CTA and to Josh Shaw for his ongoing support of this project over the past 2 years. So both by encouraging the members of the CTA to participate in our study, but also by giving us feedback and input into all the different phases of the work that we've done so far. So that has been very helpful for this project, and I just wanted to acknowledge that and thank that group and Josh Shaw for that. And so we used those interviews and focus groups to really inform the next survey. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the findings from the 2019 survey. And that was based a lot on what we learned from those interviews. Right, so I wanted to start off by by talking about the goals of the partnerships and the challenges that are faced by transit agencies. And Dan brought up some of the challenges faced by transit agencies, including lower ridership, and then being able to serve more members, providing access to more members of communities. And so what we see that I think is really interesting at the outset is that the issues that are addressed by the partnerships, so things like reducing costs, providing first last mile service, and increasing service hours, aren't challenges that are unique to the agencies with partnerships. Those are challenges that also occur for agencies that don't have partnerships. And I think this is a nice place to start this discussion and this question about what it is that makes some agencies pursue partnerships when others don't. It's not that they face different challenges, so it must be that there's something else going on. And so first, let's look at the agencies with partnerships and think about what do they all have in common, and can we think about those commonalities as potentially necessary conditions? So first off, in the first survey, I was really interested in this idea of communication between transit agencies and what that process of learning and sharing information about existing partnerships looked like. And so both from the survey responses, we see that transit agencies have been gathering information about these partnerships from all sorts of different sources, including from one another. And I think that this is really critical, that as a transit agency thinks about potentially pursuing a partnership, there is no question that they look to the transit agencies that have done them. And so our interviewees were agencies that had done partnerships. And one of the things that, far and away they all talked about was how much they had been contacted by other agencies to learn about how well the partnerships had worked for them or not. And so what's not shown here is what those questions focused on. And so certainly there were questions and information sharing about the details of the partnership, right? What of the programs, what was working on the ground, were riders cheating the system in some way? Was there, how did the geofencing work, and what kinds of discounts were the best kinds of discounts to give on the ride hailing, things like that. Those were certainly part of the conversation. But one of the things that struck me was that what was also a big part of these conversations was was how to form that relationship with the ride-hailing company. What did the contracts look like? I don't remember if Christy brought this up or if it was another one of the agencies that we talked to, but contracts between the transit agencies and the Ridehail company are something that are very critical element of these programs, and something that were talked about a lot by transit agencies and shared a lot. So that information sharing about what the relationship should be and what that partnership should look like was very important. So one condition that seems necessary is having resources for transit agencies to learn from one another about how to pursue these partnerships. And then another element that also seems very important is that there's someone on the ground in the transit agency or connected to the agency and to the work surrounding the partnership who can act as a sort of champion or an advocate for the program. And the job of that person has, involves many different things, both from really understanding what can work, from knowing what the challenges are, from addressing concerns from both the agency staff as well as the board, and certainly concerns of the drivers. And then at the same time, understanding public support at the local level for such a program to be implemented, and working directly with the Ridehail company. I'll direct everyone's attention to this quote in orange about, one of the agency representatives that we talked to mentioned how they had 6 different reps from Uber over an 8-month period. And if that's the kind of turnover that's happening, you must kind of maintain this persistence about making the partnership happen, right? Even as the things are changing on the side of the ride-hail industry. I also like that quote because it illustrates another thing that is a challenge for these partnerships, which is that they really do take a long time to plan and implement and get on the ground with a program. So having this kind of champion or advocate in or around the transit agency seems like something that came up again and again. It was something that came up again and again, and it seems like it might be one of those necessary conditions for these partnerships to happen. And then I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk at least a little bit about funding. And as Dan pointed out in his introduction, if we want to think about these partnerships as something that can happen for transit agencies in the longer term, funding is one of the things that is certainly a necessary condition, and one that we want to think about how that can be made sustainable for transit agencies. And so what we saw from our survey participants, and I even pulled a little bit of data from our current survey here, is that it seems like funding is coming from existing budgets, but we don't know if that funding from existing budgets will continue to be available. And what I also think is important maybe here with the current survey on funding that's coming from grants is that funding from within the existing budget may be matching funding, right, for these grants. So funding we know is a necessary condition, but how we can ensure that condition is met into the future, I think is one of the questions that will be great to discuss a little bit later following our presentations. I'm going to skip this next slide. Cost savings was pointed out by a lot of agencies as something important, something that they felt relatively successful about, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead now to the agencies without partnerships. And so what are some of the barriers or other factors that seem to be getting in the way when transit agencies might otherwise have an interest or some of the conditions that would lead them to pursue and implement a partnership and a program based on that partnership? So first, just recall that the challenges faced by transit agencies with and without partnerships were similar, and the goals of partnerships aimed often to address some of those key challenges. And so in our 2019 survey, we asked the transit agencies without partnerships, so for those challenges that they face, how have they addressed them? And so there were, some agencies that had addressed them in various ways with funding or other approaches, but by and large, the agencies that participated were undecided in how to address those challenges. At the same time, they were certainly considering addressing some of those challenges with Ridehail partnerships. And so we have potentially the need for a partnership. We have the discussion for a partnership. We also, among the transit agencies that didn't have partnerships, we saw generally supportive attitudes. So this set of questions in the survey asked, to what extent do you agree or disagree with these statements? And for the board and the riders and the transit agency, we asked that there was a generally favorable attitude. So do you agree that there's generally a favorable attitude? And for the most part, we do see that. And then at the same time, one of the kind of questions that's still out there about the relationship between ride-hailing and transit is whether ride-hailing serves as a substitute or a complement for transit. And so we saw when we asked about the agreement with the statement that Ridehail is a complement to public transit, we saw a little bit more agreement there than we do with Ridehail as a substitute. And certainly these, there's a small difference, right? There are many agencies that see it as a substitute and a little bit more that see it as a complement. But the point here that I want to kind of drive home is that the agencies that are not pursuing partnerships, it's not that they're, just down on ride hailing, and it's not that they don't have a potential need that could be met by a partnership, and it's not even that they're not talking about it. So what is it that's preventing them from pursuing the partnerships? And so we have a couple of ideas based on our surveys about what those things might be. So first off, we asked about different concerns among the transit agencies that don't have partnerships. And so I headlined the slide with this drivers and data because a few of the most reported concerns have to do with drivers and their vehicles, right? So drug and alcohol testing, and then vehicle accessibility as well as liability. So these are all things that are somewhat left in the hands of the drivers, and transit agencies may not see a way to kind of overcome that. And Sarah might, if we have time, talk a little bit about the issue of drug and alcohol testing. And Chrissy gave us some great insights into how this has been addressed by different transit agencies. But we also found that there was, to some extent, some misunderstanding or some additional information sharing that needed to happen when it came to drug and alcohol testing, and how transit agencies need to take that into consideration when forming these partnerships. So I'm not going to get into it now because both Sarah and Christy can provide a lot of good insight into that question, but it is an important one. And then similarly, the accessibility issue is something that you can see here as a concern. So being able to provide the service really to potential participants that might not have a smartphone or might not be able to use all vehicle types and need different kinds of vehicles in order to be able to utilize the program. So really the transit agency goal of providing more service to more people and making sure that these kinds of partnerships and programs help to drive that. Right, so concerns as a potential barrier. And then in contrast to the kind of general attitude that we saw earlier about Ridehail, and that being typically favorable, or at least viewed as favorable by many of the transit agencies, we do see limited support for partnerships. So we asked the agencies without partnerships what degree of support they felt existed within the agency for the pursuit of a partnership. And so very few of them reported that there was a high level of support. Many reported low or that they don't know, and then also many reported a moderate level of support. So we see this as potentially a barrier. And in our recent work analyzing this data, we also found a relationship between the number of concerns, right? So transit agencies could select multiple concerns in our survey, right? The things that I mentioned, the drug and alcohol testing, the vehicle accessibility. So the more concerns that they had, the lower the level of support they felt within their agency. And I think that makes sense, but I think that it's also important to take note of that finding ways to address some of those concerns may lead to increased support within agencies, and then with the work of some of those necessary conditions that we talked about, such as having a champion or an advocate within the agency, we might see more opportunities for agencies to address some of their challenges with these partnerships. So that's kind of a good lead in into this last slide that I have about tipping the balance. And so really thinking about tipping the balance for agencies that may benefit from these partnerships, but may have some of the necessary conditions in place, but that are prevented from pursuing these partnerships because of some of these barriers that we mentioned. So not having sufficient knowledge about how the drug and alcohol testing rules work and how they apply to the partnerships, as well as having other concerns and that leading to a lack of support, right? And so we think that there's some interplay between the necessary conditions of having an advocate or a champion within the agency, having the funding available, having a program that could meet the challenges, but that has to be then balanced with addressing some of the concerns and finding ways to garner support within the transit agencies if we want to see these partnerships be successful. And I think that they provide a lot of potential benefits. And so they're likely something that we would like to see carried on into the future. So we want to work in getting it right. So I'm going to turn things over to Sarah Kazemian now, who's going to talk about our current survey.
Okay, thank you, Susie, for that introduction. I'm going to talk about the current survey, what we're calling Wave 3 of our research that we just launched last week. Let me make sure I can change my slides here. Okay, so in this current survey, we're primarily interested in how COVID-19 has influenced the types of activities that transit agencies engage in, including things like Ridehail partnerships, but also other activities that they might be engaging in, and how COVID-19 has influenced or changed their focus on the innovation that they wish to pursue. So specifically, we do look at how COVID-19 has influenced these Ridehail partnerships. We resample some of the same questions from the second wave of our research that Susie just talked about, so that we can expand our understanding on why transit agencies pursue Ridehail partnerships and what are the types of challenges and concerns they face when they consider these different partnerships. So this time around, we sent invites to 411 different transit agencies and 13 transit associations. We gathered this information from the Transit Association websites, those that had public member directories. We were able to scrape that data and send them direct invitations. Those that did not have public directories, we simply sent the association president an email and asked if they'd be willing to share our survey to their members. From that, in the past week, we have 46 completed responses. I just checked this morning, it's up to 50, with 28 in progress. This is a brief overview of what the current data looks like. There are 31 rural agencies in our sample, there are 40 rural agencies in, there are 40 rural agencies in our sample, and 31 of which that do not have partnerships, and 3 that do have partnerships, 9 agencies that are urban that do not have partnerships, and 3 agencies that are urban that do have partnerships. So again, the sheer number of agencies that reported that had partnerships are much fewer than those that do not have partnerships, but it does allow us to understand the dynamics of agencies that do not have partnerships and the types of challenges that they face. Okay, so as a reminder of what Susie just talked about, our previous research has showed that first and last mile service costs, late night service, and ridership were key challenges faced by transit agencies. And one of the things that we wanted to explore here, knowing this information from the past, was how has COVID-19 influenced transit challenges? Has it made all of these issues worse, or have these issues not really changed much? What we find is that transit agencies have experienced an increase in service costs, a decrease in ridership, and an increase in low performing routes. And so one of the things that we wanted to investigate is given that COVID-19 has made some of these different issues worse, have transit agencies considered ride-hail partnerships in response to these different challenges? So first, we're going to look at all the different challenges that transit agencies face. I know the text here is kind of small, but there was a lot of challenges that we could pick from. And over here in the red are the challenges that transit agencies reported facing before COVID-19, so before March 2020. And here in blue are the challenges that transit agencies said they faced since March 2020 or during COVID-19. And so again, the trends are kind of similar. Before and during COVID-19, transit agencies reported that they faced challenges with ridership, with service costs, as well as things like late night service and first and last mile services. This time around, we included another option that we did not include in our last round, which was the perception of cleanliness. So the rider perception of cleanliness on the vehicles provided by the transit agency. And we do see a spike here from the before and during. And so unsurprising to COVID-19, this is exactly what we would have expected to see. So among the challenges that transit agencies face, we wanted to, again, reinvestigate what are the concerns that transit agencies have regarding these different ride-hail partnerships. So again, we know that transit agencies, both with and without partnerships, face similar challenges, but we wanted to, again, investigate the concerns that they had towards these different ride-hail partnerships. And the top concerns, again, come up as driver drug and alcohol testing, driver accountability, and cost effectiveness. So in other words, is this program going to reduce our costs? And with driver drug and alcohol testing, this particular problem came up both in our interviews that I did with the CTA, as well as individual interviews that I did with transit agencies and in our wave 2 and wave 3 of our survey. And so one of the key questions here that we want to address is, when do transit agencies have to perform drug and alcohol testing? Well, according to the FDA, projects that fall under the taxi cab exemption do not have to perform drug and alcohol testing. And so what Susie alluded to earlier is there are some circumstances in which transit agencies would be exempt from having to meet this particular criteria. And I think that Christy here on this call can go into more detail about that, as I believe they were one of the pioneers in having this exemption applied to the ride-hail industry. And I'm also happy to talk about it more in the Q&A, but for the interest of time, I'm also going to move on. Okay, and so here looking at all the different concerns, I just briefly alluded to what the top concerns were, but again, I break this down here by transit agency types, and I call them those that identified as rural transit agencies, as well as those that are urban transit agencies. And this is everyone without a partnership. Again, the key concerns here are drug and alcohol testing. Most people here reported that the concerns about having to do this prevented them or had a concern in their perception of ride-hail partnerships. Data sharing was also an issue. So Susie also talked about this: cost effectiveness, driver accountability, as well as vehicle accessibility. Things that seem to matter less, but were also important, were public attitudes and elected official attitudes, as well as the ability to have smartphone accessibility. Doesn't mean they weren't important, but they weren't as important as things like drug and alcohol testing, as well as driver accountability. So in this next section, I'm going to talk specifically about COVID-19 and the types of transit innovations that transit agencies seem to be pursuing during this time, and if they've shifted their gears. So we asked this question about what types of things have transit agencies considered both before and during COVID-19. And we gave them a number of different options. And here we see that ride hailing seemed to have less of a consideration than these other different types of what we're calling here innovations. And so one thing that I want to comment on here is that transit agencies that don't have ride hail partnerships are not necessarily non-innovative, right? They're not doing anything. They're just perhaps doing other things and pursuing different programs to address their transit needs. And so what we found is that many transit agencies are considering things like touchless payment, both before and during COVID-19, as well as things like fare-free transit. The reason why we don't see as much of a spike here during COVID-19 as compared to before is because if they already had this program or had already been considering it, they couldn't select it again. So here in the blue are things that they newly selected, or in other words, COVID-19 prompted them to think about this particular innovation. Okay, and so from there, we asked a series of attitudinal questions. So again, we wanted to understand the base level of support for these different innovations. So how do transit agencies feel towards Ridehail versus touchless payment, fare-free transit, on-demand, or mobile ticketing? And in the red are people who indicated a high level of support. In the green here, it's moderate level of support. And the blue is not supportive, and the purple here is people who answered, I do not know. And so what we find again is that these other types of innovations, like touchless payment, fare-free transit, and on-demand, seem to have a high level of support when compared to Ridehail partnerships. And it's not that Ridehail partnerships don't have any support, but these other different types of innovations seem to have a higher degree of support relative to Ridehail partnerships. And we asked this question again for during COVID-19 to try to gauge if their attitudes towards these different innovations shifted because of COVID-19. One thing that we might have expected to change was touchless payment. We do see a slight spike in touchless payment supports. I'm just going to go back to show it. Before, the bar was a little bit down here at close to 14 people who said they had high support. Over here, we have about, I want to say like 17, 18 people who said that they were highly supportive of touchless payment. Again, this is somewhat not surprising given the public health challenges faced by COVID-19. And so what these two graphs tell us is that COVID-19 may have shifted the way that people think about or how they form attitudes about different innovations. And so my concluding remarks here are that transit agencies without partnerships are still active and they're working to improve service, but perhaps through other programs. And that's primarily what this new survey is trying to understand. We're still trying to understand how Ridehail partnerships form, the barriers that transit agencies face, and if transit agencies that have these partnerships are unique, or perhaps there's something else motivating them to form these partnerships, even though they face the same challenges. So we're still investigating this question and hoping to understand more through our new data collection. But I think some of the key questions that remain given COVID-19 and the pandemic that we're facing is how will the pandemic influence Ridehail partnerships? I think there's a lot of questions to be asked about how these different partnerships are funded. We also found in our text entry that a lot of transit agencies reported a reduction in their revenue or a reduction in their funding, particularly if they're funded through local sales tax or some other funding measure that was cut because of COVID-19. And I think there's legitimate public health concerns and uncertainty that arises with Ridehail partnerships. And finally, here in California, we're about a week away from the election and Prop 22 is on the ballot. And so I think that some transit agencies might be uncertain on how Prop 22 might impact the stability of Ridehail companies. And so, as well as their capacity concerns, if Prop 22 does not pass, what does that say about the Ridehail companies, and are they able to have enough drivers for a particular partnership? The same question applies if Prop 22 does pass. And so I think there's a great deal of uncertainty about the Ridehail companies and transit agencies' concerns regarding these partnerships. So that's my presentation. So thanks for listening. I'll turn it back to Dan for questions, I think, or Christy.
So Christy, I think we'll go right to Christy to respond because she has some real world experience with all of this. So Christy.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm very, very happy to be here. My name is Christy Wagoner. I'm the planning director for the San Mateo County Transit District, overseeing the Samtrans bus system. And I'm really happy to have participated in this research over the last few years. And I'm really glad to be here to talk to you a bit about my experience working in transit for almost 2 decades, as well as my experience working on 2 innovative pilots. I've worked for an agency that I think was on the bleeding edge of Ridehail partnerships and implemented a partnership in 2017 that is still rolling. And I also currently work for an agency that considered a Ridehail partnership and opted to go in a different direction. So I thought I could share a little bit about both experiences. So as I mentioned, I've been working in transit for a long time, about 17 years. I've worked for 4 different transit agencies. I started in 2003 working in Sacramento, California as a planner, and then moved to the East Coast in 2005, where I worked for the Fairfax Connector bus system, which was a suburban bus system in the Washington, D.C. region. I moved back to California. The weather drove me back in 2014, and I landed in Livermore, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I was the planning and operations director for the Livermore-Amador Valley Transit Authority. And it was really there where I led a comprehensive study that was designed to redesign the bus system to address stagnant or declining fixed route ridership. And it was that study that really led to a partnership with Uber and Lyft that was launched in 2017. In 2018, I moved to Samtrans, became the planning director here, and learned that the agency had spent some time really looking at opportunities to innovate with ride-hail companies. But we went in a different direction for a few different reasons and ended up partnering with VIA on a microtransit pilot, a 1-year microtransit pilot. I'll say that, looking back, I think transit has been disrupted over the last 10 years. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. And I think many agencies are really scrambling to demonstrate innovation to maintain their relevance. And so, what have I learned by being in this industry for so long and working in different areas? I've learned that transit works in places where cars don't, where cars are expensive or difficult. Transit is more productive. And really in Washington, D.C., feeding the WMATA system, we couldn't pack more people onto those buses. And in California, it's a different challenge. We have metropolitan areas that are much more better for transit, and the suburban areas are a little more car-centric and challenging, which really, leads us to this, an opportunity with first and last mile, where you can see heavier transit ridership in the suburbs. And the availability of parking in these places really does matter, and the price of parking in these places really does matter. And so I think that really in Livermore led us to go down this path to looking at subsidized ride-hail, not only as a substitute to unproductive bus service, but as first last mile to the BART system. So just to dig into the pilots a little bit, I just want to highlight some of the differences between these 2 systems. So in Livermore, it was a much smaller system, maybe 50 or 60 buses, suburban bus operator, contracted system, small fleet. We had a very new and bold general manager. I know Susie mentioned that having that strong leadership really matters, and it really does. You need to have a champion, and I don't think it can be at your staff level. It needs to be your board or your executive leadership really needs to embrace this and want it. And in Livermore, we had a problem to solve. We had costly bus service that was costing the agency $20 per passenger trip. And there was some of these partnerships had just popped up, I think in Florida and in Colorado. And my general manager was very interested in seeing how we could demonstrate a partnership and reallocate our bus service to places where we thought we could actually build fixed route ridership. And then flip side, in Samtrans, we're about 5 times the size of Livermore, of that system. We directly operate our bus service, or most of it, so we definitely have a stronger union and more bureaucracy. And I think when I got here, I would say there wasn't really a problem to solve. There was a lot of desire to innovate, but no real problem that where innovation was needed. But I'd say both systems had similar ridership patterns. Fixed route ridership is stagnant or declining. And so, back to Livermore, as we were doing our study and learned how costly it was for us to provide service, we said, let's, instead of providing inefficient bus service, let's subsidize TNC trips. And so we engaged into a partnership with Uber, Lyft, and a taxi cab company. The drug and alcohol rules, I know you want me to expand on those. I'll do my very best. The drug and alcohol rules for any federal funded operator, you must abide by all of the federal drug and alcohol rules. So all of our bus drivers or contracted bus drivers need to go through rigorous drug and alcohol testing. However, there is an exemption that exists. So if you give your riders a choice of 2 or more companies for their transportation trip, the drug and alcohol rules don't apply. So and this was at the time when we launched our partnership in 2016, there wasn't firm guidance from the FTA on this at all. And so it was a lot of legal interpretation as to what 2 or more meant, which our lawyer at Livermore said it meant 3. So we had to partner with 3 companies. So we engaged with Uber and Lyft and a taxi cab company. And the taxi cab was there to not only provide customers without a smartphone or who paid cash an option, but also to provide wheelchair trips. And so, I learned a lot getting this all ready to go and launching it. And I can answer any specific questions anyone has. But I would say that all in all, if you look at the metrics, it was a successful program. The agency went from spending $20 per passenger trip to less than $3.50. And fixed route ridership went up, which is what I'm most proud of. So the reallocation of those resources led to that system's ridership growth over the last few years, which is pretty unique for a bus system. And at Samtrans, we've here had an interest in advancing mobility and innovation. We're nestled between Santa Clara and San Francisco, so a lot of pressure to innovate. But I think it was different here. The public perception of rideshare companies is different. I think the more impacted a local community is by Ridehail, companies can really affect the public opinion about whether an agency should be partnering with Ridehail companies. We also have a very strong workforce and union here. And so we looked at microtransit as our alternative. And we ended up converting a deviated fixed route shuttle that was in Pacifica to an on-demand platform, and passengers could hail the vehicle with their app. They could also call in and request a ride. I think we learned quite a bit. We were constrained by having only one vehicle in place. We really wanted to understand what the impact on customer experience was, because that is what matters right now, right? Technology has really, to me, heightened that customer experience. People want to know where their bus is. They want to see that dot on a map. And they want to have a good, they don't want to have long wait times or unreliable service. So we learned microtransit was really good for certain trips. It didn't work well when you had one vehicle and you're trying to transport a lot of student riders. And I do think that there is a home for microtransit in our suite of services. And it's certainly, we are in the middle of a comprehensive study, much like the one I did in Livermore. And we think microtransit will come out as an alternative, as a complement to a straightened out underlying fixed route network. And so quickly, before I turn it back over to Dr. Sperling, reaction to some of the research, highlighting transit agencies talking to one another is so key. We all share information. We do model things after one another. And I think one of the questions I have for the team is, what does success look like? That's something that we were struggling with. How do you know you have a successful pilot? So I'd definitely be curious about any research the team has done into success. I'm a part of the New Mobility Partnership for CTA, and that's a great group of people who are there to just share information and best practices. You need a board or executive champion. Funding does matter. We cannot spend federal money on ride-hail companies. So you have to get creative. You have to look at local money or grant funding. And the public opinion matters. I think in Livermore, we didn't have as many Uber trips impacting traffic in the local streets out in Livermore and Dublin. And out here in San Mateo, it's a little different. We're a lot closer to San Francisco, so we're impacted differently. So anyway, those are my thoughts, and thank you for the time, and I'll turn it right back over to you, Dr. Sperling, for Q&A.
Thank you, Christy, for some great insights. I have lots of questions of my own, but let me start out with some of the questions from the attendees. So here's a question, and I don't know who among all three of you could answer best, but there's a question about commenting on the attitudes of organized labor towards private sector ride hailing and how that influences the transit agency attitudes. So, in the research, let's start on the research side. Do you have insights to that?
We tried to get at that question a little bit. We asked about in the 2019 survey, we had questions about issues related to union and union support for Ridehail and for a program. It didn't come up as one of the primary concerns for a lot of the agencies that participated in our study. Although certainly we think that that's an important issue to address. And I think as Christy talked about, that these partnerships can be successful when they really complement the existing service. And so complementing the existing service means adding to the service and expanding what the transit agency can do, not in most cases taking away transit lines or taking away jobs from the union. And so on that part, I think a successful partnership really should operate in that way. Although at the same time, in this work and some other work that I've done related to ride hailing, there certainly is an outstanding question about, and there's another question I see on the Q&A related to the Prop 22 issue here in California. And so we can certainly talk about that side of it as well, sort of the labor of the drivers and the issues surrounding that. But I'll let Sarah and Christy, if you guys want to add anything to the first part of the question before we dig into Prop 22, because I'm sure we could spend the whole rest of today talking about that.
Yeah, I just have one quick comment. So when I did the in-depth interviews with transit agency members, the union, the support from the union did come up, I think, in 2 or 3 of our few interviews. And so it seemed, at least in their interviews, to be an important component, or to have support from the unions, or at least discuss the advocate or the champion that we're calling them, to have them meet with the union and ensure that the jobs are not being taken away from drivers in pursuit of these ride-hail partnerships.
100% agree. I think having worked again for 2 different systems, one that was much smaller with a contracted operation versus where I'm at now with the directly operated system, you have to talk to your workforce. It is about a system expansion or reallocation of service. It's not about taking jobs away. In Livermore, we had our executive director, Michael Tree, was really instrumental in having those conversations with the workforce. Out here, I wasn't privy to those conversations, but I suspect, if we were to advance anything out in this neck of the woods, we would need to talk about the reallocation of fixed route service and growing those jobs and using ride-hail partnerships as really that complement to bring more people to transit.
So let me follow up. So there's questions about the funding. So, Susie described that there are several different funding sources, but my perspective on it is that there have to be permanent funding streams for these to be more than just pilots. Otherwise, they just die and disappear. Do you have any insights into that? Are there any of these agencies that do have a permanent funding stream, for instance?
Right. I definitely think that that's an important issue, right? That funding is certainly a necessary condition. And then not only for a pilot, but for the longer term, of course, we would like to establish some sources of funding or ways to draw on existing sources that can be more sustainable. I think the one case that struck me as seeming to have worked it out, at least to some extent, was the Pinellas County case in Florida, where they've been able to consistently over time, and they're one of the longer running partnerships. So over the past 4 to 5 years, consistently get funding from a state source that provides funding for lower income and disadvantaged passengers. And so that source of funding that's available has fit well with their program, especially because a big piece of their program is to provide these passes for late night workers to use the Ridehail to access transit or in place of transit when transit isn't running. And so in that instance, it seems like one of the or maybe one of the only good examples where they seem to have secured funding in the longer term. Whether or not those kinds of sources are going to be available into the future, I think is one of the important policy implications of this work, is that needs to happen in order for these partnerships to be a sustainable and ongoing part of the way that we provide public transit and what we can do to ensure that happens. So I don't know if you guys want to go ahead and add to that.
Do you have any another question is, do you have any insights into what are the attributes of the agencies that are for or against these partnerships? Who are they?
Sarah, I don't know if you're seeing more from the current survey about that question.
Yeah, so I'll start with the interviews, because in the interviews I spoke with people for like 20-30 minutes individually, and so I was able to get like more in-depth information about why people pursue these partnerships and why they simply are not interested in the partnerships. And at least in cities, I think Christy alluded to this, where transit works, people don't need or want these partnerships. So when I spoke to individuals from areas like in San Francisco in the Bay Area, they were less interested in pursuing a Ridehail partnership. One, because the public wasn't very supportive of it. Two, they were concerned about things like adding congestion to their roads. And so I think in some part it depends on the context that the context that the transit agency is operating in. But I think our like more like mega level or macro level explanation is that you have to have a champion regardless of whether or not you want to pursue this. So agencies that have a champion or an advocate for these particular policies are more likely to see them implemented than when there's a low level support or where there's no one who's really trying to push this particular type of policy forward. Because again, overall, we see that transit agencies face similar types of challenges, but what we find is that some just don't pursue Ridehail partnerships as a response to this particular challenge.
So let me be a little more edgy here. So there's a question here that says, in effect, says, are these transit agencies looking at innovation too narrowly? All of the, they preferred all these, more narrow, almost operational type innovations versus that, something like partnerships, which are, fundamentally structurally broader, more different. And so I'm interested in any of you answering it. Partly when Christy answers it, she said when she went to Samtrans, there was no problem at Samtrans. And I would have not said that myself. But so let me start out with, the researchers. What's your response to this? What did you learn from the research? Do you have anything to shed, any insight to shed?
Yeah, so I think if I understand your question correctly is, do transit agencies pursue these partnerships specifically to resolve a particular obstacle or challenge, or do they just pursue them to show innovation? And we actually find that sometimes they pursue them to show innovation. This came out in our data as well as in our interviews. So I don't know if that answers your question, or if Susie, you want to jump in.
Yeah, let me broaden it a little bit, for Susie or Christy to answer, and that is because there were a few people that made comments about this, that, it goes back to what I said. Transit in this country serves 2% of passengers. There's a whole lot more than 2% of people that are either physically disabled or, economically disadvantaged. So a whole lot of people, transit could be the demand in some abstract level, the demand is far greater than 2%. And so part of it is how these agencies see their mission, I think, is part of this. And, I wonder if that ambivalence that Susie and Sarah came up with kind of reflects a attitude that, okay, we're kind of an operational type organization, and, if we can get the buses out there on time, we're doing fine. So Susie and Christy, what would you say?
Yeah, no, I would definitely love to react to that. So I guess not that Sam Trans is problem free by any stretch, but I think what I meant by that was in Livermore, we had done this big study to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the fixed route system, to look at where were we competing for our own riders, right? Where do we have service right on top of itself? And the end result was a desire to reallocate resources to really provide two bus lines that could connect to every BART train. That was we had done our market research. We learned that for folks who are already riding BART, they were more likely to be open to riding a bus. So we thought that was a unique opportunity for the fixed route system. And in order to achieve that, we had to pull service from somewhere. And we identified some really unproductive, a circular local route in Dublin that was $20 per passenger trip. So there was a financial reason to do it. I think at Samtrans, having just come from Livermore, I was like, I didn't want to just plop a pilot on top of our network, because I do think that there are only so many, we are limited with our market. And I think there are probably more people who are willing to ride a TNC, a Ridehail service, than might be willing to ride transit. I think that there are differences there. So I think that, for me coming in, I'm very risk adverse, and I wanted to be smart about where I thought we could learn the most and not just compete for the same riders that are already on our system. So, so that's really what led us down the path that we went on. So I don't know if that is helpful.
We'll let you go with that.
All right.
Someday we'll come back to it. Another question is the distinction between microtransit and, what we'll call, the TNCs, Lyft and Uber. So, and when we talk about microtransit, it can be actually run by the agencies themselves, or it be contracted out, like Christy talked about with VIA. How does that, in your research, is that an important distinction at all?
Yeah, I think it definitely is an important distinction, and one that we actually kind of tried to address, I guess, in a way in our first survey, where we focused only on partnerships that dealt with ride hailing, because there are potentially big differences between a partnership that uses TNCs versus a partnership that uses microtransit, and the way that they operate and what they do, and how they're run can be quite different. So we focused first on just the partnerships with ride hailing. And I think that the differences matter because there can be more passengers on the microtransit routes, and there can be, they can serve different purposes, right? So they can maybe fill in for a low performing route. Whereas the TNCs, we wouldn't want to see them replacing a route. And then we do see one example of TNCs replacing route in Florida to save costs, but yeah, I think that definitely they can serve different purposes. And the other thing that I was going to add about as far as the differences is that we ask a little bit about on-demand service being something that transit agencies might be providing themselves, and maybe a little bit with the assumption that that would be with sort of a microtransit cutaway size vehicle. And that I think is an important important distinction that when it comes to the microtransit service, that is something that transit agencies can provide themselves and with their own staff. And so some of the issues and concerns that they may have about partnering with TNCs could be reduced when using microtransit. However, to make microtransit cost effective, there are then other concerns that would come up. So really making sure that the right service is applied to the right location, I think is kind of the underlying important thing to be thinking about. That some instances microtransit would operate better, and in some instances a partnership with the TNC would be better.
So maybe Christy, so the question would be to you, why did you choose to go with an outside company, and why did you decide to do it in a microtransit mode?
Sure. So for in the Dublin example, Livermore Dublin, with our Ridehail partnership, the thought was that the supply of vehicles is already out there. The TNC presence is already there. Uber and Lyft are already there. The agency doesn't have to spend any additional capital investment to provide these trips. We can just subsidize, trips as they occur. And I think that that's key. Do you have TNCs where you're located? In Pacifica, in Samtrans land? We had heard there aren't a lot of Ubers and Lyfts available, and so I don't think agencies Susie and Sarah can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know if there's contracts that exist that require a certain level of or a certain number of vehicles in a certain area. You can educate me on that, but it certainly wasn't in our agreement that thou shalt have an Uber within 5 minutes of a request. So I think that mattered, particularly in Pacifica. But it was really, we purchased a license from Via. We actually did operate it in-house, but through our contractor. So, and we learned a lot about, I think, what we're good at and what we're not good at. And I think my advice to the district as we, evaluated the pilot was, if we're going to do this again, we should really look at a turnkey contract, because some agencies are better than others at really embracing technology. I mean, and this was, this isn't just summoning something from an app. This is like 360 degrees of technology that is like driving the service, and old ships don't turn very fast. And so I think, we learned that we were challenged in some ways here. And I think, as we explore microtransit in the future, it will be through a turnkey contract, because I think there are folks out there that can do it better than we can, and we can, do our big bus service, very well. We can, continue to focus on that.
Okay, let me ask a semi-edgy question here. It comes from one of the attendees. He talked about automated vehicles, robo-taxis. So I think the essence of the question is, how disruptive would it be, and what should or the transit agencies be doing or thinking, or should they just ignore it? Or they probably are just ignoring it, I would suspect.
If I could jump in, because I love autonomous vehicles, I don't ignore it. I think it's that's what's coming, right? And we actually launched a pilot in Dublin as well, a partnership with Easy Mile, building on some of the AV work that was being done in Bishop Ranch. So dabbled in that innovation as well. But I think it's the same conversation that we have to have with labor about jobs. We have to talk about how AV can complement our system. How can it make us safer? I think that's the first step. I think if we put our heads in the sand, it's going to be here, before we know it, and we'll be even further, irrelevant, right? So I would love to start having conversations with our workforce about small applications of AV, vehicle to infrastructure connections, so the bus knows if a pedestrian signal has been pushed. So to prevent, accidents, we can maybe pack more buses onto our yards if we have, automated movements on our facilities. So there's applications of it that I think are less scary for folks, but we have to have that conversation. We just have to start talking about it.
So Susie, it looked like you had something you were eager to say.
Well, no, actually, Dan, I sort of wanted to push back on you a little, because I think that you've certainly looked at autonomous vehicles, I think, more than Sarah or I. And so, you know, I don't know if transit agencies commonly have the kinds of attitude that Christy does, where they're really being embraced, or if they see it as, you know, another form of competition. We haven't really touched on that too much in this study, and it didn't seem to come up much in our interviews. So as far as our work, we haven't really gotten into that question. I'm sure that the labor issue is one that, you know, that will be there because it will reduce the costs of labor if it's, you know, on the TNC side. If it's on the bus side, you know, I don't know.
You know, I think I would broaden it to play off of what Christy said a moment ago, and that is that transit, how do we create that discussion where transit can provide more service to more people and ideally at less cost? And the robo-taxis, you know, provide a good opportunity for that. And, you know, I always thought that Livermore project is a model for how transit agencies, at least some of the smaller transit agencies in smaller cities, should be thinking about it. Ones that serve suburban areas, you know, the cost of one of you said, you know, I think Christy said, you know, the cost of serving passengers in these suburban areas is typically over $20 per passenger. And there's clearly some of these private companies can do it less. And so is there a mechanism for the transit agencies to work with these private operators? And you know, the answer comes back to what Christy says, you know, you got to, and you, Susie, you know, you got to deal with union issues, labor issues, you got to deal with the funding streams. Where does it come from? So this is an important time for transit. So that's why I was so enthusiastic about this research and this discussion, is because, you know, the transit agencies are just focused on survival right now, you know, for the next year. You know, many of them in smaller cities actually probably will disappear unless there's some massive fusion of funds. So it's hard for them to think, you know, beyond a year but on the other hand, if they don't, you know, it's going to be a disaster as a lot of the money runs out. So I think we're supposed to end just about now. Maybe leave a couple closing thoughts. So Mike, why don't you take over? This is your job.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, first of all, a big thank you to all of our attendees and a really big thank you to all of our presenters today. Susie and Sarah, great job presenting your findings. Christy, we really appreciate you joining us to share your insights, and Dan for facilitating a really great discussion. So I just encourage all of our attendees to take a quick survey that'll pop up on your screen as you close out of the webinar. It'd be great to get your thoughts on today's presentation and help us improve as we move forward. Other than that, just close out and thank you all for joining. So hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Good work.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.